almost be describing a kind of nightmarish metaphysical world that he was dealing with. But I think with Stan, people who have Mars, Neptune, I very seldom have seen Stan really angry at anybody. It's like this world just doesn't really trigger him into an angry charge. But where the yang energy gets expressed is and where the courageous warrior energy gets expressed is in this domain of Neptunian experience, LSD experiences and so forth. And then many powerful warrior experiences indeed happen there. That Venus right at the angle, you see that where, it's like very much an artist aspect, and the focus on the convivial, the social, the aesthetic, being surrounded with beauty. I mean, like Stan and Christina's house, very just filled with objects of art, and of course we've all seen his drawings and paintings, and he's described the extent to which his musical and aesthetic interests have been central in his life. I haven't talked about the moon. By the way, I'm just giving like headlines. A chart is one. I could easily talk for 3 hours about this chart and just be starting to really unpack it, because there's many dimensions to it, and I'm just giving a few headlines. But the moon being at the right in the crosshairs there of this T-square, that brings in the moon has to do like with the matrix of being, the great mother goddess, the womb of life. If the sun is who you are, that you consciously identify with as your central principle of selfhood, the moon is who you are before you even think about who you are, because it's your psychosomatic foundation of your being that is grounded in your relational field that starts with the relationship with the mother, your first relationship, and your ancestral ground, and the womb out of which you emerge. The moon's the ruler of the night sky, and the day sky is ruled by the sun. And when the night sky is pregnant with the day, and then the solar birth takes place. And the moon has a lot to do with the unconscious, because the solar consciousness of the kind of Cartesian ego suppresses the emotional and relational and imaginal dimensions of life in favor of this kind of more narrow-focused consciousness. So the moon isn't simplistically the unconscious. It's just what a certain form of solar consciousness tends to be unconscious of. And with the moon right there on the T-square, I mean, some of the main things I would look at with that is, first of all, you often see it in the charts of where the mother is very central, very powerful, like the moon is. In fact, often there's a number of major feminine figures in the childhood with moon opposite Jupiter. When you were talking about how many women were part of your kind of early childhood experience, nanny, the cook, your mother, etc. I think you used the word complex, feminine presence. I was thinking of my son, Christopher Flash, growing up here at Esalen with many mothers. He's also a moon Jupiter square in his place. But with the moon Saturn, one of the ways moon Saturn comes through is like not having children. So I mean, you didn't have biological children. On the other hand, you have all these kind of, in some ways, you mothered the birth or rebirth of just, hundreds and hundreds of people around the world. That's the Jupiter moon. But by facing the the trauma of birth, the Saturn, the hard aspects of life, and it was your work, which is Saturn as well, and there was a kind of karmic yoga that you shouldered in mediating this kind of emotional support of the death rebirth process through reliving the birth. One of the things I liked about Jeffrey Kripal's book on Esalen was he mentioned how much Stan's work was a kind of, his whole psychology was a kind of tantric psychology of the great mother goddess. In some ways, the whole perinatal theory is an expression of Kali, who was the centerpiece of your climactic session where you had that picture there. Well, I'll just in the mid 1960s, 65 to 67, you again had Saturn opposite Pluto, but Uranus was in conjunction with it in the sky and with Pluto, and so you had that same energy where that powerful perinatal intensity was there. And Saturn both requires the encounter with the hard trauma of birth, but Saturn's also giving the discipline of engaging it. It's also it's making it manifest. It's bringing it into form. Saturn's, as Stephen Arroyo says, is the divine sculptor that sculpts the diamond body and makes things actual, makes things real. There's a way in which the Saturn-Pluto aspect is generally the aspect of trauma and of the birth trauma. Like Otto Rank, the first theorist of the birth trauma, had Saturn square Pluto. But it's also the aspect of the person who takes on the powerful, through facing the hard aspects of existence, bringing about a profound reconfiguration of the structures of life and forging structures that then endure in a very powerful way from then on. There's a great solidity, a gravitas to this. Think of Thomas Berry, who's another Saturn-Pluto person who talked about the great work that our generation has of carrying on this great work of history, of mediating our humanity's movement into an ecozoic era of more ecologically intelligent harmony with the rest of the Earth community. The moon oxide. One could say many things about this, which I don't want to go on too long about. But one last thing I think I'll mention is one of the things that I did in the end of my book, Passion of the Western Mind, which is this narrative history of Western thought, and I bring in Stan's work in the epilogue, and I basically show how if you take Stan's theory of the perinatal sequence and you wed it to you synthesize it with Thomas Kuhn's theory of the structure of scientific revolution. And it's the same theory. You have a paradigm is like a conceptual womb that nurtures thought, and there's a development that takes place within it until it can't hold that form of consciousness any longer, and anomalies begin, and contradictions start coming in, and there's a crisis, and then until a new Promethean genius comes in and suddenly opens up a new paradigm, and there's suddenly a sense of breaking out of an outmoded state of consciousness, dying to the old untenable state and moving into a new universe, as in the Copernican Revolution, for example, which was the paradigm case for Thomas Kuhn. And that's basically what the perinatal journey is all about. And what I did was show how you can look at the whole history of Western and modern consciousness and see how basically if you apply Stan's theory of what the individual goes through, that's really what we are as a human community, and particularly the form of the human that modern civilization has been driving for the last 500 years, and that we've gone from this highly differentiated Cartesian individuality and subject-object split to the point where there's an existential crisis, there's a sense of alienation from an absurd universe, a crisis of mortality, a deconstruction of meaning. It's classic shamanic initiatory ego-death perinatal experience. And our whole collective psyche seems to be going through this. So you can kind of apply Stan's perinatal conceptual understanding to the unfolding of the evolution of consciousness and of our own historical moment. And the fact that we are today in a situation whose archetypal dynamic is essentially resonant with what Stan was born with. You have there's certain ways in which Stan's psychology, I think, offers a kind of illumination to understanding our moment in history that is not there are really no parallels to it. It's interesting, Jung was born under the only other time that Saturn, Uranus, and Pluto were in a T-square in the last 200 years, in 1875. And he too had that kind of total collapse of dealing with psychological crisis and then opening into this powerful transformative state of being that affected so many others. He had a different emphasis. He had so much of a Neptunian emphasis, just as Freud had a Plutonic emphasis. So Freud's emphasis was all on the biological and the id and the sexual instincts, while Jung's emphasis with his Neptune Sun aspect was so much on, the mythic and the mystical and the moving everything towards the archetypal in a kind of imaginal way, active imagination, dreams, and so forth. But Stan and Jung provide a kind of Jung had such a sense of how you can hold the tension of opposites faithfully enough until the transcendent function kicks in and like the divine opposites come together and give birth to a new reality. But you have to suffer the crucifixion, as Jung put it, of that holding of the opposites that are tearing you in opposite directions. You can't do an end run. You can't do it. There's no easy way out. You have to hold it, and then some larger principle of transformation takes place of death and rebirth. And that's essentially what Stan's psychology is about. And what birth is all about. When the propulsion is happening, the contractions are happening, within one frame of reference, it's completely intolerable and there's no resolution. It's a no exit situation. And then when the birth takes place, the propulsion and the contractions you suddenly discover that they are serving a larger purpose, but only through the death of the old reality. The collapse of the old womb gives birth to the new form of life, the organism that's been born. I think I'll just end this with someone posted on my cosmospsyche.com website this poem that was so remarkable, so short. It's called A New Beginning. I shared it with Rebecca the other day, and actually everybody that's seen it, like Rebecca and myself, were quite struck by the power and simplicity of this capturing of the perinatal reality that Stan did so much to unveil for us. The birth of a child must seem to him death. his first intake of air, his terminal breath. And if he had words, he would curse in the womb at being evicted from his comfortable room. But his first cry must turn to a cry of surprise, to find a new world of a much larger size, and to grasp that this painful change in position was certainly not end, but merely transition. It's a man named Rob Bauer sent that to me and posted it on it, and it really captures that the paradox of the death rebirth experience and what birth is experienced by us as we lose the old reality. Okay, I know I haven't done justice to this, but it gives you a little sense for how this works. When we do things like Stan would describe, say, a very powerful experience he had where he sat for a person going through an LSD experience who went into a state of possession where essentially her voice changed into a dark male voice, and her face totally changed, and her hands moved into like claws, and this voice introduced himself as the devil to Stan, and for the next 2 hours, Stan was confronted with a very powerful satanic force that essentially started telling Stan what was going on in other parts of the clinic that even Stan didn't know about, but that when he checked out later were happening. Anyway, this is a woman who was very disturbed in so many ways, suicidally depressed, was in prison, had drug problems, anyway, I won't go into all the details, but Stan said it was the most intense 2 hours of experience that he had outside of his own LSD experiences. And so you not only, what's of course very interesting is to see her chart and see the transits that she had when she basically had this happen. And by the way, once this came to consciousness and got expressed in the session, after that point, she couldn't remember the possession state after the session was over. But her symptoms, the suicidal depression, the tic douloureux that was constricting her face so painfully that they were going to have to, she had spasms of the face. This was gone. There was just a radical change in her whole situation. She was released from the mental institution / prison that she was in. Anyway, her transits and the time that it took place in September '68, right at the time, Simply for the Devil and Manson and other things are erupting in the collective psyche with that plutonic energy. But it came to a very benign result, even though it was such a problematic state. And it was really interesting then to see Stan's transits at that time. And over again, when we look at the transits for the major turning points in his life, for his own death rebirth experiences, but even for individual sessions where he's sitting for another person that has that kind of powerful impact on him, the transits are quite significant. In that particular case, Saturn was T-squaring his natal Saturn and Pluto. Saturn's right on Uranus. Once in 7 years that happens, and often there's a real encounter with quite challenging, even dark, metaphysically dark, constricting experiences. But he also had Uranus trine Moon at the same time, where you often have a kind of, like in this case, a liberation of the feminine figure in his field that took place at that point. Okay, so those are a few headlines. Stan, you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, that story is in When the Impossible Happens. Interview with the dead.
You should talk into the
you mentioned before you mentioned before that when we do the course at CIS or some longer workshop, that we look at the different schools, the different psychological theories, and see how they sort of reflect the chart. So, but you say how all the three perinatal matrices are in my chart.
They're so powerful.
The second matrix is the Saturn Moon, and then the third matrix is the Pluto Jupiter, and then you have the Uranus is the fourth matrix. So,
the way Jupiter puts a sort of smile on things, like the way, those of you who know Stan's work will be familiar with the way he will take, there'll be images like Giger's images of different forms of hell, or his description of various horrific experiences, and Stan will be kind of smilingly talking about them, and he can even kind of dwell on them as a kind of like a fine connoisseur of different forms of torture, and I mean, partly it's because he's so fully assimilated those experiences himself that they don't hold any. He's not trying to wall them off. He's been through it, and it's all right now. In fact, it's like as he's jumping Jack Black. He's got he's been he's twice born, as it were, so he's not pulling him down. But just generally speaking, if you look at his descriptions of various plutonic third matrix experiences, like all those descriptions of the Titanic battles, or the descent into all the sewage systems of the great cities of the world, and or dinosaurs killing each other, and his tasting the swamp in his mouth as he's dying in a dinosaur death battle. There's a kind of Jupiterian expansiveness to his embrace of these highly plutonic third matrix experiences. That's the kind of thing that Jupiter brings into those different matrices. At Jupiter square Uranus, it's like so much of the sudden release, expansive, a sense of incredible wonder. The number of times that you would come back from the session and talk to me about, this was incredible work. I've experienced many things before, but this one was really, you wouldn't believe what new reality has now, we now see. That's the Jupiter-Uranus wide opening of horizons past any limit. Anyway, there's much more in here. One thing I would say about getting a reading from somebody, try to get readings from a number of really good astrologers, because your chart is something like a great poem, like by Rumi, or by Rilke, that you read more than one translation. There's more than one great translation that can be done for a great poem, and because the translator is in some sense unpacking new dimensions, or dimensions that he or she has a special capacity to see and help enact. So there's no final reading of a chart, because there's so much archetypal mystery that's packed into each birth chart that you could never exhaust it. So tomorrow, a number of people have asked about getting readings, and tomorrow I'll give a couple of names of people who are really fantastic archetypal astrologers who fully assimilated Stan and my work.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
So, we talked about this, how different schools sort of focus on different levels of consciousness, and I mentioned in that context how surprised I was that Jung did not really appreciate the power of biological birth, although he described and also his followers described in such detail the archetype, the transpersonal dimension of birth, but he just absolutely missed that there might be any kind of a traumatic power in birth. So I think it was that Neptunian perspective was compared to Freudian Platonic.
Richard, did your chart and Stan's chart go
Yeah.
together? I mean, you guys have had a lifetime.
Yeah, it's been pretty cool how, we have, those of you who are astrologically literate, I can just say, well, we have Sun trine Sun, we have Saturn trine Saturn, so like our not only our work together goes together so readily, but also even our conceptual structures kind of mesh in ways that seem to be more. There's a kind of almost like cosmic harmony to them that precedes us in some sense.
The moment ago, on a run, he spoke of the birth trauma. He said the actual trauma of being born, I believe, is a very powerful impact on the ego and show itself throughout the life of a person. Right, now this is very important for an ego, but it is for highly traumatic, when you fall out of heaven. But you take literally ironic positions of the birth trauma as having, you might say, a psychological effect. Don't you see this is an event that happens to everybody, that exists, that it was as you've been born. So everybody is born, has undergone that trauma. So the word trauma has lost its meaning, I think. So, in other words, it is a general fact, which you cannot say it is a trauma. Yeah. It is just a fact. Yes, I see. You see, because you cannot observe psychology that hasn't been born. Yeah. Only then you could say what the word trauma is. Yeah. And then you can't even speak of such a thing if it's just a lack of epistemology. Back to you, we've been talking about the early oral level, and you point out you want to.
What year is that? What year is that? 61.
No, this 57. Had to be earlier, a little earlier. Yeah, he died in 61. Some was saying that it was that this particular psychiatrist coming from Texas, that Jung had not a very positive feeling about him, and that he was kind of irritated during the interview, and that might have affected his kind of impatience with his answer. The interview that you see in the famous BBC interview with Freeman in 1959 is you see Jung's twinkle in his eye, and there's a lot of depth and charm that he allows to show, and that actually leads from that interview to the final book that he did, Man and the Symbols, where he wrote that final essay for many people to be able to understand, rather than the smaller number that usually can take in Jung's writings. So, shall we watch the? Okay, so this is the documentary. You want to say anything about the documentary, Stan?
Well, we had in our training Betsy Gordon, who has a foundation, and this was, her gift was to make it. Basically, her foundation gave the money to Colleen Elgin, with the partner of Dwayne Elgin. And she created this document. It was very, very handicapped in that, because we had a fire of our house in February 2001, where a lot of the material really was lost. So I think she did a pretty good job with what she had to work with. Yeah, please.
Yeah, at the very beginning you talked about after 80 years or more, almost 60 years now of research, that you've got kind of a view of where things either are going or should be going around psychology, and I'd be very interested in hearing more thoughts about that, and maybe even more than we necessarily want to spend right now, but I'd be very interested in kind of hearing your view of where you think things need to be going in around consciousness and psychology.
When I was, can you hear? Yeah. When I was approaching my 70th birthday, I got a phone call from Jane Bunker, who's my editor at State University New York Press, and she said, Stan, we have published several of your books on different aspects of your work. Would you consider writing a book that would kind of bring it all together and be like an introduction to all the other books? And then she said, and would you specifically focus on the changes that would have to be made in psychology and psychiatry as a result of these observations? And then there was a sort of little pause, and then she said, well, and would you actually make suggestions, what specific changes would happen to integrate all these challenging observations? So I got very excited because I was at that time planning to retire, or at least semi-retire, and we had a training happening all over the world, and we needed some kind of a text so that people in different parts of the world would be, teaching the same kind of material. And so I wrote the book Psychology of the Future, where there were about 6 different areas where I believe we would have to change our thinking. So the first point was changing somehow the understanding of the relationship between matter and consciousness. That consciousness is really a primary attribute of existence, but it's not something that comes out of the neurophysiological changes in the brain. Then the second one was expanding the model of the psyche, which is now limited to postnatal biography and the Freudian individual unconscious, and adding the perinatal level, the matrices, and then the whole vast area of transpersonal experiences. And the third one was if we work with emotional and psychosomatic disorders, the traditional idea is that if these problems are not biological, that they started after we were born. For Freud, the newborn was a tabula rasa, so what you become is the result of the postnatal influences. So that would be another major change. Then the changes in strategy of psychotherapy. Instead of trying to use your intellect to understand how the psyche functions in general and the function of the client in particular, and then come up with a technique, to change the dynamics of the client's psyche, you would use holotropic states, introduce or induce the holotropic state of consciousness, and then allow the healing intelligence of the client to do the work, and you would be just supporting that process. And then the last major change that I was suggesting was using really the combination of responsible work with holotropic states with archetypal psychology and astrology, or archetypal astrology, Rick calls it. So those would be the major changes. I believe that this would be a revolution that would be comparable to what happened in physics in the first 3 decades of the 20th century. And in a sense, it would be a very logical completion of what already happened in physics. But it's, the problem with it is that it's such a radical change. It's not, the observations cannot be handled by a little patchwork. What we call ad hoc hypothesis. This would be a radical overhaul. We would have to admit that we had it wrong. And that maybe, shamans of illiterate cultures sort of knew more about the psyche than we do. So, that's in a nutshell would be the answer.
My question is about your experiment with psychedelics during the experimentation that you had. Have you ever asked your patient before taking the psychedelics to try to focus on a certain state of mind before they go in, and whether that would impact the way they would experience work? In other words, if their state of mind was, they would go in with certain objective or intention, would that affect the way the psychedelic work?
Well, yeah, he will know that intention. So what I'm getting from you is that I had the spontaneous experiences, and then when I took psychedelics, did I have an intention to direct?
No, I actually am referring to the patients that tried, let's say, LSD. At the time that they have taken the LSD, have you ever asked them to have certain intention before they take the medication, and whether that would affect how it would
Actually, the opposite. We are trying to discourage people to bring any kind of plans that would come from their current understanding. One of the things that we do as an introduction to the breathwork is they try to bring yourself into the present moment, try to assume a kind of attitude which the Zen Buddhists called the mind of the beginners. That you sort of let go any kind of plans, any kind of programs that you have, and you allow that inner healing intelligence to do the job.
So someone might come, whether it's with the holotropic breath work or with psychedelics. Stan and I did work in a program in Canada using psychedelics with a staff of a addictions treatment center. There was a man who was running this treatment center who had LSD in his safe and wanted to begin a program with his clients, his patients, using LSD for the treatment of addictions. And in order to do that, he invited us to go to Canada for a month and to give LSD sessions to the staff in his clinic. So we ran sessions with the staff. So Stan and I had decided the experience of working with the holotropic breath work, also had the experience of working together with psychedelics. But always we've had the attitude of there's a healing force within each person that is wiser than we are, or than the person, individual is. It has its own wisdom, it has its own timing, and its own way of moving through you. And that even if you have an idea of what you want to work on, let's say I'm in a crisis in my marriage and I want to figure out what I do next. That may be there near the surface of the psyche, but the answer may come from a very different direction. Or you might have a completely different experience, which will take you in a direction where the marital problems don't have the seriousness or the impact that they did before the session. So one of the things I've appreciated about Stan and his work and his personal ability to not control in any way the outcome of a session. In fact, he'll tell me, if somebody comes along and shows me that there's some new direction that the psyche is taking, I'll be the first one to want to know about it and to study it. He's a curious man. Sometimes I feel like I'm with a 4-year-old.
Exactly.
And he'll explore new experiences, new people, new food. I mean, he's eaten grasshoppers and witchetty grubs and all kinds of things that I wouldn't touch. But this is Stan and his way of being in the world.
But that's why I was wondering whether his curiosity would...
But it's also trust in the inner wisdom of each person's healing ability.
If you look at the current scene, we have enormous number of therapeutic schools, and each school will give you a different story. What are the basic motivating forces in the psyche? Why do symptoms develop? What they mean? How you interpret them? And each of those schools gives you a different technique of what you do with your client. And we somehow got used to it. We don't even wonder about it. There are not 50 schools of chemistry telling you what happens when you put two substances into a test tube. So there's something really wrong. A lot of emphasis is put on interpretation. I remember in my own analysis I would sort of bring up something and the message would be something like, well, that's what you think, but what it really is, But the problem is that there is absolutely no agreement between these schools. So if you have a problem, you can flip a coin, you choose a school, and each gives you a different story. You'll be asked to do different things. Now, if this were really the way to do it, what you would have to have is one of the schools would have to be closest to the truth, to the real description, accurate description of the psyche. And if you would look at the therapeutic results, they would be distributed like on a Gaussian curve. There would be one that has it right and gives the best interpretations, and it's all the good results. And the others would be kind of distributed on the descending parts of the curve. You don't get that. We don't have any proof that one school consistently is getting better results. Actually, the differences are within the schools. There are bad therapists and good therapists within each school, and there is no proof that one of them is superior. And very likely, what is effective in psychotherapy is something that cannot be even put into scientific language. Like the quality of the human encounter between the therapist and the client, or the feeling of the client of being unconditionally accepted by another human being, typically for the first time in their life, because they didn't have it before. So this is a radically different approach, where you allow the psyche really to heal itself. I think Jung was the Jungian school was the closest one when he used the active imagination and so on, and talking about the individuation process, where the psyche is really guiding the process rather than being there and fixing people, trying to fix people on the basis of some kind of an intellectual theory.
Stan, can I add one?
Sure, please.
Sorry. We all suffered that one. Okay. Something that's not being said here about I think we recognize that the key ingredient in Stan's approach to psychotherapy is this, in a sense, he facilitates more like a midwife than someone who comes in with a kind of technically oriented obstetrician who's going to control the birth process, but instead there's a support of nature's own organic wisdom. And I think you're both capturing that very well here. What's, I suspect, not being said, because in a sense it's kind of invisible, is the extent to which the trust in the psyche and the trust in the unconscious that is at the essence of this approach to psychotherapy is effectively being conveyed by Stan to his patients in a way that this is part of the invisible transference, I think, that happens. You, first of all, doing one-on-one work with the LSD psychotherapy patients, but then later in the holotropic breathwork, working with many people at once, you're communicating your own experience of trust in the psyche, and they pick up that trust through you, so that they can start entering into scary places because you somehow have conveyed to them with a kind of quiet confidence that you've been through this and they can go through it. And even those many people who say, first of all, you've encountered thousands of people directly in your lectures, and you give your instructions before they do their holotropic breathwork. But even when you're not there for their own sessions, they've often seen like the video of you giving the instructions. And so there's a kind of invisible, even though the transference has been taken out of the picture generally in your way of framing the psychotherapeutic process, I think it's kind of invisibly happening in a way, even in this room, and in the many month-longs that you led, and in the holotropic breathwork community. You went through. You were an explorer that went through something that and successfully came back home, and so you can communicate that with a kind of confidence that helps people enter into those spaces that they might not otherwise have. And this connects with the point you were just making about what the difference between the effectiveness of different forms of psychotherapy has less to do with the theory and more to do with the person who is the therapist. And that's also true for this approach, your approach. Other people can use psychedelic therapy or holotropic breathwork, and they might not be such effective guides or facilitators of the process. In fact, it can be very potentially problematic, especially with psychedelic therapy. And I think you've kind of placed an invisible atmospheric presence
And
in
a morphic field.
a morphic field that I think has had a very deeply healing influence on people. It encourages them to face their shadows in ways that they might not have otherwise, because you were able to do it yourself. So this is kind of just adding back in the human therapist's influence. Yes, it's the trust in the psyche and trust in that the inner healer for that person. But that person gets some of the trust of their own inner healer by seeing that you have managed that journey yourself.
Yeah, but when we do the training, we've trained over 1,000 people, and the important part of that training is people's own experience. It's much less of a theory, and people do really a lot of work on themselves, and we get a number of reports on how successful the breath work was.
We require in
workshops of other people.
We require in our trainings that people take at least 3 years to complete the training, because it takes a long time to begin to be comfortable with these experiences in oneself and then with other people. So we require a lot of work from people with their own inner work, as well as interning with certified people, doing the work with other people, and then finally doing it on their own. We've had really fine facilitators come out of that.
They learn to trust the process by they had so many experiences.
I don't want to discount the absolute importance of trusting the inner healer in themselves, and that's what a good holotropic breathwork facilitator or LSD psychotherapist would do. I'm just saying there is an influence that you've brought into the whole field from the beginning. It can be a kind of intangible and invisible influence, but it's there. And just as Jung has an influence on all Jungian analysts because of the confidence with which he experienced it, and just kind of wanting to honor that, not taking away anything of I totally agree with the idea of the inner healer of each individual, bottom line. But we are also all in a community of relationships, and we depend on those who go before us and are able to help shape our own journey in a way that, as a result of what their experience and their wisdom, and I'm just acknowledging the extent to which you positively influence us.
This is a question for Stanislav. So your whole work at some point was affected by you and Richard by astrology. You got interested in astrology, and that informed your what? So at some point that informed your observations. Is what I get. What you saw in astrology, the people you encountered, informed your observation of the LSD experiences and I guess the breath work. It made sense of it in a scientific way. So my question is, what is your cosmological interpretation of why that works? Because it doesn't really make any sense in the Cartesian paradigm that we're living in. Can you give us your sense of what's the bigger picture of that relates to?
Well, you see, you cannot add astrology to the current sort of Cartesian Newtonian worldview and where you think in terms of cause and effect, linear causality, and so on. So just to quickly give you the kind of idea that I would have after having sort of seen many of these situations and having experienced sort of insights into what appeared to be the cosmic fabric. The idea would be that there's an archetypal domain that is very much like the Platonic forms and ideas that is superordinated to this one, and kind of forms and informs what is happening here, and that there is a kind of universal blueprint, master plan, in which the dynamics of the archetypal world is systematically correlated with the movements and angular relationships of the planets, so that the planets are not really doing anything. They just indicate what is happening in the archetypal world and what kind of energies you would therefore expect on this level. So you would have to have a completely different understanding of reality, that when there's superior intelligence that sort of guides things.
So the other part of that question is that the ancient people developed astrology before the scientific revolutions, and how were they able to see that at that time? Because they had a sense of that we,
Yeah, but we have experienced, seen and experienced ourselves, that you can get this kind of an illuminating insight, like in a non-ordinary state, you can see the whole picture. So I think Rick would see it in a similar way, that astrology didn't develop so that you say, well, this is happening and the star is over there, and you sort of somehow for over a long period of time you put it together. It comes as a kind of illuminating insight, how the universe works, and then you fill in the concrete observations, but the idea is a revelation. The original idea is a revelation. It's not a discipline that sort of is created from scratch by individual observations.
You can track it like in terms of the evolution of consciousness. Somebody like Rudolf Steiner talks about how we have the growth and the development of the thinking consciousness that particularly happens from the Greek period on. It coincides with a certain diminishment of a kind of natural spiritual clairvoyance, or what Jung and the French anthropologists call the participation mystique. That diminishes as a certain robust objectifying thinking consciousness emerges, and astrology clearly emerges out of that earlier period of before the breakdown of the bicameral mind, as Julian James would call it. Maybe just one or two more questions before we finish our comments.
One of the most exciting things that I got out of this weekend so far is this idea of the transits and using, kind of like we mentioned, working with this person who had a difficult cross.
Oh yeah, the Grand Cross. Yeah.
And so that you could kind of anticipate what kind of experience you might have. And then when we were just talking about, having this beginner's mind, so how do you bring this, and just trusting the inner healer, how would you integrate this archetypical aspect into the work?
Here's one way of looking at it. Think of it like if you're a seasoned sailor or a surfer, you simultaneously bring in a lot of technical knowledge and experience of what it's like to be dealing with the waves, the wind, the surfboard or the sailboat, etc. But when you get out there and you're doing the sailing or you're doing the surfing, you don't control the process. you use everything you know. You see where the energies are. You check the weather reports and so forth. But then you go with the flow of the wind, and it becomes a co-creative process. You're simultaneously being informed by your knowledge of, let's say, where the planets are and the archetypal dynamics, but you're not. If you try to use that information to kind of control and predict with like a kind of technocratic attitude of I'm the master of my fate and I'm the king of the world, you're gonna fall down. It's a much more modest but still thrilling interaction between the knowledge of the archetypal conditions and the openness to what the universe presents. And it will always, I am always simultaneously surprised and affirmed by when I go into a session. I know what the transits are, but I'm always going to, there's always an element of the creative trickster that the cosmos is going to play with me on that. And so there, you have to have a kind of humility about the whole thing. You want to say anything about that, Stan? Okay. Maybe just, please, you first, and then we'll end with you, okay?
Well,
Rita.
thank you. Regarding labeling, like the DSM-5, is there psychopathology, or is it just different grades of spiritual emergency? How do you feel about it?
I wouldn't use the term psychopathology now, with the exception of those states which are really organic, when we are discussing this kind of process, that subject of this discussion during this weekend. Something that appears to be diagnostic categories becomes sort of states where there is a process that is in its essence healing, but that gets sort of fixated, gets stuck in a certain place. So you can, for example, mobilize depression, which is whether the underlying matrix is the second matrix, the experience of being stuck in the womb. If you can mobilize it, you move to the third matrix and you're dealing with whole other situation. So I have seen, for example, in psychedelic session, a person within hours of the session to move into what would be a completely different diagnostic category. Like a person who was gay and had a lot of problems with it, to the point that he tried to castrate himself with estrogens. Take some overdose of barbiturates. He had very, very deep suicidal depression, and within a few hours of the session, he emerged free of depression, but with a hysterical paralysis of his right arm. And then he took another session to work through the problems that were underlying that, so that if you have a traditional psychiatric approach, when you actually suppress, you're holding back the symptoms rather than working with them, sort of activating the symptoms, then it appears to be certain pathological conditions. But if you use a process that mobilizes actually the energy underlying symptoms, then you see that it's a very fluid kind of a situation, and the conditions will be changing from session to session. So that the concept of psychopathological categories sort of disappears in that process.
So does the holotropic breath accomplish that also? Moving them.
These changes?
Yes.
quite often, yeah. We have, we have even seen it in weekend workshops, but certainly when we did month-longs or when people do the training where there is a number of the sessions, then you see it very, very typically. We have seen people breaking out of depression, in one session, for example. You cannot promise that, but it can happen. But, there was a 5-day workshop here at Esalen where there was a woman who had a history of, it was about 3 years of chronic depression. And in the first session had a powerful birth experience, and then in the second session still there was some birth material, and the next day in the morning it still wasn't finished, and we sort of worked with it, and she went into a situation where for a long time she was singing, chanting in a language that we didn't understand, but there was somebody in the group, a psychoanalyst from Buenos Aires, who knew the language. It was the Sephardic language. It was a mixture of medieval Spanish and Hebrew, and she was chanting, I am suffering and I will always suffer, I am crying and I will always cry, I am praying and I will always pray. And she did it with tremendous emphasis for a long period of time, and then sort of finished the process, and then she lay down and she was in a kind of blissed out state. So within 5 days of the workshop there was such a major change. It involved that Sephardic prayer. You don't read in psychiatric manuals that can heal depression by Sephardic prayer. But we have seen those kinds of situations where the changes happen and you have no idea why they happened.
Did she know she was singing Sephardic?
No, she didn't know. She didn't know ordinary Spanish. But it just synchronistically happened that the psychoanalyst who was in the group was Jewish, and this was his hobby. He knew the Sephardic language. He came to us and said, "This is fantastic. Do you understand what happened?" That no, she was chanting in Sephardic.
One last one. That's it.
Richard, I've got a question for you about the current transit situation we're in. You suggested one that 2008 to 2011 is something like the 30s, which I guess coincides with the economic condition. But there also seemed to be something similar to the 60s, and my sense is there's a tremendous shift that's underway in sort of the global consciousness. And I just would be interested in your thoughts about what cycle we're currently in right now.
Yeah, well, it really is a kind of combination of the 30s and the 60s. We've had this massive economic Great Recession, biggest one since the 1930s, and at the same time there's clearly very powerful emancipatory reformist energies at work in the collective psyche. The empowerment of and political activation of youth, of women, of the Arab world, of having Obama as president, even if he may not fulfill every liberal and progressive hope that an aspiration that was associated with him, just having him as the president with 2 little African American girls running around the White House is a revolution that can't be taken away. And it comes directly out of the civil rights movements of the 60s that now kind of is diachronically coming to fulfillment in this era. I think we all see many signs of very powerful transformative and liberating trends at work. Ecological consciousness, rapidly spreading, but it's also spreading out of a crisis, out of a pressure, a kind of initiatory or perinatal pressure is at work. There's a lot of uncertainty as to how it's going to unfold, and I guess the main thing I'd want to emphasize about that uncertainty is that you always have uncertainty in any authentic rite of passage or initiatory ritual, in any psychedelic session or holotropic breath work or inner exploration. There's always going to be some element of uncertainty. You have to not know what the result is going to be in order to have the power of the transformation to take place. You can't have a pretend near-death experience. You have to really think that everything's at stake in order for the impact on the spirit to take place. So humanity's in that critical crucible right now. For those of you who are interested in a fairly comprehensive analysis of the current world transits, I wrote an essay, an overview of the world transits from 2000 to 2020, but particularly focused on the 2008 to 2012 period. And you can access it for free on it's for the Journal of Archive, Journal of Archetypal Cosmology, and you can access it at it's archivejournal.org, ARCHAI, like the Greek word, ARCHAI, journal.org, and you look there and it shows Richard Tarnas. You can click on that essay, and it's called World Transits 2000 to 2020, an overview, or a brief overview, something like that. And it's a kind of epilogue to the ending of Cosmos and Psyche, because Cosmos and Psyche was finished in 2005, and so it's 6 years later, and it kind of brings us up to date.
Thank you.
Okay, let's get a good night's sleep, and we'll see you here at 9:30 tomorrow. Thank you.